Welcome to the Nantucket GAM. I'm Annalie Gilbert-Keith. Today we are continuing our deep dive into the tragic story of the Essex. For those of you that didn't catch it, we suggest listening to part 1 of this episode to hear the story of the fate that befell the whaleship. Today I am joined by Thomas Parrish and Nat Philbrick, author of In the Heart of the Sea, as we discuss the history and the legacy of the Essex. Nat, to start us off, I'm curious what drew you to the story of the Essex and how did you first hear about it?
I heard about the story of the Essex as a kid, growing up in that nautical center of the universe, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where my father at that time was an English professor who taught Moby-Dick regularly. And when we were just little kids, he told us a bedtime story about a whale ship that was rammed by a whale, and bad things happened to the survivors. And I don't know how my brother and I grew up without seeking psychiatric advice. I guess that's a tribute to my mother, but it was a story that was sort of swirling around in my brain from a very early age. And then it was really moving to Nantucket back in '86 that through the lens of Moby-Dick, I began to become fascinated with Nantucket history and learned the story afresh. I guess maybe it comes as close to destiny as you can be that one day I'd write about it.
How much inspiration did Herman Melville take from the Essex in the writing of Moby-Dick?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think where the story of the Essex begins, the ramming of the Essex, that's the climax of Moby-Dick. So it's almost like a baton is passed by Melville to the Essex. Moby-Dick in many ways is a survival tale in which Ishmael is the sole survivor. And I think it's really interesting and evocative to look at Moby-Dick as kind of a commentary, in a way, of the real-life story of the Essex disaster. The whole element of what ifs with that they could have gone to the Pacific Islands and not had to struggle through all those terrible ordeals that forced them to live their own worst nightmares, which was their fear of cannibals. They became cannibals. All of that is in there in Moby-Dick in various ways about, he has a chapter in which he talks about how the Pacific Islands are a refuge, a welcoming refuge, and all that kind of thing. So I think it's there. It's not direct, although he does at one point talk about the Essex disaster and say, hey, if you think this story is outlandish, this really happened. And so it's an absolute integral part of Moby-Dick, but it's there in ways that are indirect and I think thematic, and in terms of mood and character, its fingerprints, if you will, are all over that novel.
When we tell the story of the Essex, the true story of the Essex, the whale almost takes on a persona as the antagonist to the story. And of course, it is an animal. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's a hangover from Moby-Dick or possibly an inspiration for Moby-Dick.
Yeah. I think it works a couple of ways. Chase, in his narrative of the story of the Essex, talks about how the whale seemed to be animated by a very human kind of intention when it went after them. It didn't seem to them to be a random act. It seemed like this whale was angry with them and was enacting his vengeance upon them. And that's an aspect that, once again, is in Moby-Dick, but in a couple of ways. The whale, Moby-Dick is a character. I mean, he's one of the great non-human characters in all of literature. And that's the thing. People think of Moby-Dick as the greatest novel ever written, and I do. I think it is. But it's also it is that because it is so rigorously based on the real world. And so that even a fantastic creature like a white whale that rams and sinks the ship seems so specifically described. He's got a wiggle waggle when he swims. He's got, a hump and, all this kind of the scars and all that. You see him, he's there. He is a presence. Melville could not have created that kind of verisimilitude without having something real being such an integral part of inspiring the novel.
The version that Herman Melville knew would have been the account by Chase. But how well known was the story of the Essex in the lifetime of the sailors who survived?
Yeah, it was pretty darn well known. And
it was, interesting.
Yeah, it was, well, first off, it was a part of the lure of whaling. It was the story that was told to Greenhorn, very early on in the voyage. And then, with Melville, you get him, he's heard about it, and then they're out there not far from where the Essex actually went down when they have a gam with a ship from Nantucket that has Owen Chase's son aboard. And they talk, and the son is the one who gives Melville a copy of his father's book that he reads in a night. As Melville would say, it had, a pretty extraordinary impact on him. I'm paraphrasing there. But so, can you imagine that? He's getting, he's talking to the son of the author of this narrative, who hands it to him, and then he reads it, in the same waters where it all occurred. I mean, that is pretty powerful stuff. I think, that's sort of the ingredients for what would ultimately become Moby-Dick. And the other side of it is, Melville comes to Nantucket a year after writing Moby-Dick.
The year after, he did not come before writing it.
No, and that for me, that was a crushing blow. When we moved to Nantucket in '86, and I was very happy. I'd never spent any time on the island, but since it was the port of the Pequod, I thought that this is a great idea. And, it took me a few years to realize Melville had never visited Nantucket before writing Moby-Dick. So that, the greatest chapter of them all, the Nantucket chapter, was written, without having seen the place. Talk about the power of literary imagination. But then he visits Nantucket the summer after. Moby-Dick has been a critical disaster. It hasn't sold, and that's had to have a profound impact on him. And he comes to Nantucket with his father-in-law, Judge Shaw, who is, presiding over court on the island. And they seem to have stayed at what's now the Jared Coffin House. And years later, he would write a poem, extended poem called Clarel, which talks about a visit to the Holy Land, in which he talks about a character meeting a Pollard-like character in a fog, and describes all this. And so I think, and Melville would write in the back pages of his copy of Chase's narrative that, sometime in the 1850s, I visited Nantucket and met Captain Pollard. To the islanders, he was a nobody, but to me, he was the most extraordinary man. And I think for someone who's just had the novel, that he knows is amazing, completely fall like a stone to the bottom of the sea, Pollard, someone who'd lived through the worst that can happen to a whaling captain. He lost the Essex, then he would lose the two brothers after that. Pollard was an inspiration to him in a way for, how he would lead the rest of his life.
So coming back to Nantucket a little bit, we see this really powerful reaction from Melville, but how did people here respond to the news of what happened to the Essex?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because outside of Nantucket, the Essex was news. I mean, it was the Donner Party 20 years earlier of the sea, and it would become told in one of the children's readers that was read in almost every school.
The children's readers?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
The fourth edition, I believe.
Yeah, right. If you were a kid in the United States, you probably knew about this story because you had to read about it in school. But on Nantucket, it was a very different approach to the story. There is the story of a young girl, Starbuck, I believe, who hears about the Essex and asks her parents, what is this? And the response was, Miss Molly, we do not talk about the Essex on Nantucket. That this was a story that was too close to home, that did not necessarily reflect well on the islanders. Story of survival cannibalism is not going to be something the Chamber of Commerce will be looking to.
Unlike today, of course.
Yeah.
Right. Unlike today, it's come around, but it really hit the island hard in all sorts of ways because not only islanders were put in this horrible situation, having to eat the flesh of their dead shipmates, but it paints whales as this dangerous force that. If all whales took this attitude, whaling would come to a potential end. And so it was a story that was not the kind of thing Nantucketers wanted to retell or circulate widely.
Owen Chase's narrative was published just about a year after the Essex sank. How did Nantucketers take that?
Yeah, I haven't found much evidence of how it was received. But my sense is that it was not necessarily received well. Particularly a Nantucketer putting himself at the center of a story about something as terrible as the Essex disaster may have, sat with people in a not good way. Chase, I think it's significant that Chase's next voyage would be on a ship out of New Bedford. Not from Nantucket. He would go on and have a, exemplary whaling career. But I don't know if, the publication of that book was greeted with pride and appreciation by his fellow Nantucketers.
How should we think about the story of survival? Is it that they were just outmatched by the circumstances? Do we think, were there decisions that could have been made to alleviate the situation? Is it a fault of human decisions, or were they basing it off of incomplete or just wrong information?
Yeah, kind of a little bit of everything. It's interesting. In Chase's narrative, he doesn't really make it sound as if there were much options for what they were going to do. It's really with Nickerson's account, which came out much later, and Nickerson had talked to other Essex survivors before writing his account relatively late in life, that he provides a pretty detailed account of the decision-making process that led them to go on what was really an impossible voyage in 3 whaleboats, an attempt to travel more than 2,000 miles against the prevailing breezes to a supposedly civilized coast in South America. That's what they ended up doing, but they definitely talked about potentially going to the South Pacific Islands. And there are indications that Pollard seems to have thought that was the preferable way to go, but it was Chase saying, we don't want to risk our lives with cannibals. And most captains, traditionally, a captain's word is the word, we're going to do this. Pollard looks to have adhered to a more consensual form of leadership. Clearly, they were trying to figure it out. And they've just been rammed by a whale. They're thousands of miles from Central America. The islands on the other side are unknown to them, really. This is very early in Pacific whaling. And in just a few months' time, those islands will become basically the backyard of Nantucketers. There will be future Nantucketers born on those islands when their mothers accompany their fathers on the whale ships. And so, now it looks like, sure, just go to those Pacific islands, it'll be fine. That's us looking back. And
hindsight's always 20/20, right?
Yeah, and these guys were, they had, I won't say they were terrified, but they had to be pretty darn close to it. And, it's the world had been violated from their standpoint. Whales never attacked ships. This didn't happen, but it happened in this case. And you begin to, I think it's a quite natural human tendency to say, oh, I just want to get back to, humanity, something known. And the thought of sailing out into those unknown islands where the only thing they really knew were these rumors of cannibals was very difficult for them to consider. And so, it led to, in retrospect, poor decision-making, but thereby hangs an incredible tale.
You mentioned how Nickerson's account came out many years later. It was published in 1984.
Right.
Were people still talking about the Essex at that point? And how did that shift the conversation with Chase's narrative having different information? Yeah,
it was published 2 years before I arrived on Nantucket. And there was an article, a little article in Time magazine referring to the fact that this long-lost account had been found. I wasn't on an island when Edward Stackpole published that account. It was, part of the lore of this island and whaling. I mean, I had one whaling historian when I said, I'm thinking about writing a book about the Essex. And he said, why would you want to do that? Everybody knows that story. Which, if you're in whaling circles and whaling historical Nantucket circles, it was kind of the old chestnut. But obviously, once you got beyond the island and whaling communities in New England, it was a story that most people had never heard. Henry Carlyle had written a novel, Jonah Man, about it around that time, which is, a great novel. And Thomas Heffernan had published an account of Owen Chase and the Essex, in which he didn't mention Nickerson. But, what interested me about writing a book about the Essex was the fact that there was this Nickerson account that really hadn't been integrated into any book-length study of the disaster and seemed to me to, bring forth some provocative second opinions on critical moments in the story. As historians want to use accounts that are as close to the actual event as possible. Nickerson's is far away, it's a survivor late in life. And so he's inevitably seeing it from his own perspective, and he didn't apparently want his descendants to think of him as a cannibal because in his account, he claims they never were reduced to eating human flesh.
Interesting. Does he claim that or omit it?
He never mentions that they ate human flesh in his account, even though Chase does. And apparently he was writing this for a writer of boys fiction and, bestsellers of that kind. And maybe he was already editing himself for the potential audience. I don't know. But, what did impress me was, it is different. It's got a voice that is definitely his. And, the sketches that he included with it are amazing, crude. But, they're of someone who was there. And so anyway, so that was the different accounts was, just another reason why I wanted to write In the Heart of the Sea.
Besides the conversation about cannibalism, is there any other glaring differences between the two accounts or any contradictions between them?
It's more what he goes into that Chase chose not to mention. For example, when the whale, in Nickerson's account, the whale strikes the Essex and then it goes under the Essex and surfaces on the other side. And Chase refers to that, but what Chase doesn't include is the fact that, according to Nickerson, Chase then reached for the killing lance and motioned to stab this whale that had dared to attack a ship. But he saw that the tail was so close to the rudder, he feared that if he provoked it in any way, it would take out the rudder and they'd be in big trouble. And so he relented, and the whale sprang to life and would ultimately ram the ship. You can see why Chase would choose not to include that. And it's interesting that Nickerson felt compelled to include it. And so it adds to the
what ifs.
The what ifs and the human element that, with Nickerson's, Chase is giving his account of the story he feels comfortable with. Nickerson was someone else telling the story after the other account had come out and telling what he felt needed to be put in there, but, also amending it in ways that probably reflected better on him than, admitting that he had been involved in survival cannibalism.
So in your research, what do you do with those omissions? How do you sort of interpret them in your work? And how does it inform how you think about what we do know?
Yeah. Well, it's the historian's job is to look at all the various accounts and weigh each one as to, its plausibility and, looking at what does the teller of this have to get out of it, and, those kinds of things. And then ultimately it's you tell the story as closely to what you think happened based on the evidence as you can. I saw no reason to suspect that Nickerson made up the story of the fact that Chase was tempted to attack the whale that had attacked them, or the fact that Nickerson went into more detail about the decision making that led to what the course they ultimately followed. But there was plenty of evidence pointing to the fact the crew members aboard Chase's whaleboat did resort to cannibalism. So in that instance, I went with Chase's account. You might say, well, he was writing for an audience and maybe he wanted to make it more sensational. I doubt that, really. And often the notes of my books, I go into detail about the various, at specific points, what we know and, the different accounts, and to provide context for the reader who is interested in more information about it, and to provide a little bit of a window as to what went into my decision to depict it as I did.
This is a moment of seeing people at literally the very worst, right? Mm-hmm. They are eating their friends, and in Pollard's case, actually eating his family to survive. Is it possible that there are parts of this story that just weren't recorded, or that there are holes in our knowledge based off of a little bit of self-censoring of this story?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think, all the accounts we have, not all the accounts, but the vast majority of them come from Nantucketers. And when you look at the demographics of death in the Essex disaster, it's kind of extraordinary that, all the African-American sailors didn't make it. And the 3 off-island white crew members decided to stay at the island rather than continue on the boats with the Nantucketers. And, was it clear to everyone on those boats that the Nantucketers were looking out for themselves? Did they take any extraordinary actions to look out for each other at the expense of the non-Nantucketers? The Nantucketers don't talk about that, but it would not be out of the realm of human reason that, a group of clannish people from the same town, who knew the sea better than anyone, would make someone who is not of that group worry about being on a boat with them with dwindling supplies of food and water.
It does seem like quite the coincidence that of all of the men in the boats, the only ones who survived are Nantucketers.
Yeah. Yes. And in the Heart of the Sea, I examined accounts from concentration camps, from, all sorts of survival situations. And it is, there is a tendency for people with, connections to band together in these situations.
It's human instinct.
Yeah. And it's protective. It's, particularly if you're an officer with younger crew members, you look out for them in a way that you might not if they were not from Nantucket. And so I think there is definitely an element of the story that we don't know. And, who knows? Were they all completely upright and fair? They could have been. But when things are that bad, when you're reduced to the worst extremity there is, I don't know. But I think it's a distinct possibility that there was stuff going on there that made it very hard to be a non-Nantucketer in those whaleboats and have any hope of surviving the ordeal.
In your book, you sort of go into the politics of social dynamics on Nantucket with, I think it was Matthew Joy who had been written out of the meeting, the Quaker meeting. Nickerson wasn't born here. And
he's a Washoe.
Yeah. And those politics matter a lot on Nantucket, but then when you're in a survival situation, it's the tie here that ends up counting.
No, and there were complexities of the clan, hierarchies within the clan that I think are hard for outsiders, not only geographically, but in time, to appreciate. Off-islanders, when they ran into Nantucketers, it was like, woo. Ben Franklin, whose mother was born on Nantucket, has this wonderful account of some Nantucketers came to Philadelphia, and he invited them to come to dinner if they didn't have something better to do, and they didn't come. And he sort of snidely says, apparently I'm paraphrasing here, but they're just different and very inward oriented when it comes to the island. And the Nantucketers, they didn't trust Boston, for example. If something was bad, it was called a Boston notion. And,
I didn't know that.
And off-islanders were known as, we call them Washoeshores. They called them coofs, which was, you didn't want to be a coof. So, and they were very proud. They were, they were the richest, probably, town per capita in New England, and where, you had Salem and Boston and all sorts of other highfalutin places. And so they were insular, there was pride, and it was a unique culture. There was this little petri dish out there on this island out to sea where people had lived very intensely dealing with something as strange and complex as whaling. And it just created a different kind of society.
One of my favorite parts of In the Heart of the Sea is that part where you're talking about this near the beginning and you're spelling out phonetically different phrases that Nantucketers had. Yeah. It had me laughing out loud because some of them were just so strange and I can't think of them off the top of my head. But I love that part. And, you're talking about like the code of which direction people are whittling in and what that says about them as a whaler. And it's just this little code. This is a little bit of a pivot, but I wanted to bring up the film adaptation of In the Heart of the Sea. And I haven't actually seen it, so I shouldn't ask questions too deep here. But the sense that I get is that it's a little bit more fictionalized, maybe a little more than a little bit more fictionalized than your book. How did it feel to have a film adaptation of your book sort of take a different perspective like that?
Well, it's a movie. And so, and the demands of a movie are very different from the demands of writing a book. It's a collaborative medium. To do a story like this would require a big budget. So the studio really wanted to have a plot that would be exciting, and was really lucky to have Ron Howard as the director, who was just a wonderful person to work for and a great human being. And the cast was amazing when you look at...
It's a loaded cast.
And you'd look where there's the incipient Spider-Man is there.
Tom Holland.
Tom
Cillian Murphy. Chris Hemsworth.
Right. It's an incredible cast. Yeah, and visually, I think they did an incredible job. It does a really good job of what it's like to be at sea, and it has real documentary value in terms of what was involved in killing a whale. I mean, that's extremely well done. Yeah, they messed with the plot. There's a little bit of Jaws there. The whale follows them, but it was just an extraordinary experience. I know it brought people to the book that would not have necessarily read it, and I will be forever grateful for the experience.
Amazing. I just have one final question for you. It's kind of a big one. Why is this story still worth telling?
Why is it worth telling? Because, this is I think ultimately a universal tale. That's why I was attracted to it. I had written about the Essex in A Way Offshore, but I wanted to take this story and make it not something of Nantucket history or whaling history, which it will always be a part of, but tell it in a way that a reader in Nebraska who has never seen the sea can see things in it that relate to their own lives. The universal aspect of a survival tale is ordinary people pushed to extraordinary extremes by forces beyond their control. And, what does it do to people, a group of people? What happens to them? And so I think, and in the heart of the sea, I was trying to latch on to those elements of the story that would go beyond a Nantucket-centric look at history and really speak as best I could to the human condition.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Whether it's the movie or the book, the Essex is probably one of the most well-known stories that people ask about at the museum. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us, for writing your book and giving us the pleasure of reading it, and for joining us here on the Nantucket Game.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
It's a real treat to get to chat with you. For more information, head to nha.org or check out the show notes. This episode was developed and created by Thomas Parrish, Adam DeLogue, and Annalee Gilbert Keith. Special thanks to our Chief Curator, Michael R. Harrison, and our Director of Collections and Research Services, Amelia Holmes. Our theme music was composed and performed by Isaiah Williams. Other music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. The Nantucket Gam is a production of the Nantucket Historical Association. Thanks for listening.